at first on your sabbatical, like make space to heal. Like, get out of your head, get into your body, like heal, congratulate yourself for the leg of the journey you've just been on, instead of just going immediately into this like productivity thing where you swap out like work productivity for like an actual really important list of things that you want to do that are like intrinsically motivated, but it's just like another level of productivity. So like take a beat, rest, recover, and then use that next phase to experiment.
Hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Arti Shahani. I am the host of a podcast called Art of Power. I'm a veteran NPR journalist, also guest hosting Fresh Air and KQED's Forum. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker. DJ Dadana is a senior lecturer in the Entrepreneurial Management Unit at Harvard Business School. One of his students lovingly ran up to him upstairs and said, "Professor." And that is not how I originally knew DJ, so I was like, whoa. And he is also, more pertinent to tonight, author of a new book called Big Time Off: The Transformative Power of Sabbaticals and How to Take One. I have to say, the title, Big Time Off, is a really good title. It really works for me. In 2019, DJ founded the Sabbatical Project to define, explore, and research sabbaticals. As part of DJ's own sabbatical, he walked 900 miles on a pilgrimage in Shikoku, Japan. Aww. That is music. And in addition to that 900-mile walk, he ran a poverty research lab at his alma mater, Notre Dame. DJ, welcome.
Thank you.
Congratulations. I refer to books as babies. I've had the honor and pleasure of giving physical birth to a child as well, so the analogy really holds. And while you did not push out a baby yourself, you are a father of a newborn.
I'm a father.
And so is the newborn and Kaz your partner in the audience?
Gio's right over there.
Oh, okay. Well, welcome. And thank you for coming all the way from Cambridge to San Francisco on the baby's first flight after 7 weeks on planet Earth. Woo. All right, so DJ, first hard question. I read this line from your bio that that you ran a poverty research lab at your alma mater, Notre Dame, while you were on sabbatical. And this is something I noticed about myself and about so many of the people you profile in your research, and I wondered about you. When you were running that poverty research lab, did you describe it as a sabbatical, or did you try to make it into like an important job you were on?
No, I think that, as I ended the exploration part of my sabbatical, I kind of decided I'm going to donate the rest of this year to something, to some cause. So I'd been serving on the board of this research lab, and I said, how can I help? And they said, actually, we'd like you to come help run it, to hire someone that was their first kind of non-academic director. So I came in as the first non-academic to help them find someone that was certainly much better than me to run it, which I did. So it was like a big, great moment.
And so I guess the spirit of what I'm really asking there is, I think a lot of us are so identified with and defined by what we do for work that we've always got to have this work thing we're doing to hold like some armor in front of us to show the world that we're worth something.
Yeah.
And did you fall into that as well?
Upon coming back, I mean, listen, I think that, life makes sense looking backwards, but you have to figure it out going forward. And at that time, like going to South Bend, Indiana and working with some academics in an organization that no one had heard of was not something I was necessarily touting to the world.
Oh, okay.
But it allowed me to partner with academics at Notre Dame to do the research. And so it kind of was another moment of synchronicity where you have time, you're giving your time, you're being open to new possibilities, and conversations led to the establishment of the research.
Okay.
So it's interesting. I was very much not knowing still what the next chapter of my life would be. I think when I was on sabbatical, it gave me the confidence that I could figure it out, and I could be kind of in this liminal space a little bit longer. But I was certainly working, which it didn't feel as much like a sabbatical.
Okay, got it. a lot of it's interesting. Let's do a little bit of term definition. And I will say that every adult I spoke to today, I spoke to a lot of kids too, but every adult I spoke to today had very strong emotional reactions to the idea of this conversation. Sabbatical brings up a lot for people. I was speaking to a former colleague of mine from NPR. She's shifted jobs over to publishing. And she's like, oh, what's the topic tonight? I'm like, oh, sabbatical. She's like, oh, I do a mini sabbatical every night. I don't check my emails.
Yeah.
And I was like, girlfriend, I don't think that counts.
Yeah.
And then I started explaining via DJ's research why it doesn't. But why don't you, in your own words, tell me, is that a sabbatical?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to yuck anyone's time off, yum. But I will say that like everyone who has taken a sabbatical has taken a vacation. Most of them have taken tech Sabbaths over the weekend. And those people are saying that something profoundly different is happening with that amount of time. And that was, when I came back from my sabbatical, talking to people who had also taken it and hearing the same chorus around like transformational, like identity changing, best experience of my life, and really saying like, okay, why is there no research out here about that? And why do some people call it a sabbatical and other people say I'm just traveling, or other people say I'm having a soul-batical, or whatever term they want to use? And I talk about in the book where I actually say that I hate the word sabbatical. I think it's this crutch that we use because we think we need some sort of identity and some like term for a thing that we're doing, when in actuality we might be kind of wandering in the woods for a little bit. So I put my kind of stake in the sand on like extended leave intentionally taken from your routine job. So extended meaning measured in months, not days or weeks. Intentional, not meaning that you take a sabbatical on purpose necessarily, because a lot of times you're snatched out of your routine life. But once you're there, you're there. And you're not looking for a job, you're kind of like in that space. And then from your routine job. So a lot of people will do things on their sabbatical that might feel like work to other folks. I remodeled my own kitchen, which like coming from someone who had kind of soft Excel fingers, it was like, it'll be empowering to like learn how to swing a tool. And but that doesn't sound like fun to most folks. So I love that folks are using the term mini sabbatical, micro sabbatical. But I do think there's something that you can't just like squeeze into the amount of time that we feel like we have in our society, and it like takes more space to kind of breathe.
So it's the big time off.
It's big time.
And if you're getting paid for it, is it a sabbatical?
I mean, I think those are some of the best sabbaticals. Like the world that we want to inhabit, and part of the movement that I'm trying to kind of catalyze or push along is one where employers are saying, we value you on the medium, the long term. Like we recognize that you need times to rejuvenate, to work on something you care about, and your job is here and safe on the other side. So we're not quite there yet, but I think about it in this realm of like paid parental leave, where it's a movement where over time we've made a lot of progress. The U.S. is still the only OECD country that doesn't have like government mandated paid parental leave. But it's something that, as you apply it to a job now, and California was actually the first state to give state-supported parental leave. It's a bit of a head scratcher when there's not paid parental leave. So that's like, I love it when it's paid and when people don't have to feel like they're scrimping and saving or having some emergency to take time off.
What would be an example of that from your research?
Of someone that took paid?
Sure. Yeah, and then I'll expand on there.
I talk about the Army War Colleges, actually. So every officer in the military is required to do this kind of like active duty reprieve, where you're going and you're kind of like, you're doing schooling, but you're stepping away from the battlefield. You're integrating with other branches of the military, and you're kind of like, you're learning, but you're also spending time with family and other colleagues. There's a lot of companies, especially in the Bay Area. Adobe's had a sabbatical policy for almost 50 years. Where it's just kind of, Genentech is a big biotech firm that has a sabbatical policy. And so for those companies, it's not that big of a deal. It's just, it's part and parcel of their work.
In that definition of just establishing what do we mean by this thing, that's an imperfect term, there's something that you highlight that I would love for you to expand on. And it's really this concept of identity, shedding identity and forming a new identity. And I'll preface it with a bit of my own experience, which is that I know that in reading your book, I realized I actually have had 2 major sabbaticals in my life, maybe 3. But a key aspect for me in my own transition, for example, from community organizer to business journalist, and then business journalist to author, was extricating myself from everybody who was familiar and kind of being in this empty space where I didn't feel anything was urgent. And so much of my sense of being important was conflated with just the urgency of like, oh, I answered my boss's email at 4 a.m. I'm so good. So can you talk a bit about how identity works in this?
Yeah, I mean, again, one of the reasons why people use the term sabbatical is because, unfortunately, in America, when you meet someone, you're like, what do you do? Right? That's at least in the front kind of 5 minutes of the conversation. And so saying like, well, I'm on sabbatical gives you a pass. When I looked at the research on identity, because the funny thing was when I started doing the academic research and partnering with academics, all the feelings that I had had and the experiences that I'd had and heard of, like obviously people have been studying this for a long time. And so seeing that there's actually research out there about that and learning about this concept of, is an identity, your personal identity, something that you uncover like an archaeologist, that you kind of like hew back the layers to find out who you really were? Or is it something that you're kind of like piecing together as you go and it changes? And so those are the different theories and ideas. But what you're describing, I think, William Bridges talks about is fertile emptiness. And so can you be in this liminal space between 2 identities where it actually gives it space and time and the ability to experiment with new identities, figure out what you want to try on, what you want to keep and what you want to throw away. And it allows us to kind of progress. Otherwise, as I'm sure most of you know, if you've left a job, the most likely job you are to have after that looks pretty similar to your old job. Right. You're using your network, you're using your resume. And so if you really can step away from that and say, like, do I want to move towards something that feels more authentic to me? Do I want to move in a totally different direction? Do I want to experiment with something creative or become a person that remodels kitchens, which definitely was not going to be? Then that's available to you, which you can't do on a vacation or over a weekend, right? It's like actually embodying and like inhabiting a new identity.
I think that's a good setup for talking a bit about the designing of a sabbatical. Because as you've pointed out, a lot of people end up taking one and then in retrospect, oh yeah, that's what it was. But that doing it in retrospect, you miss out on the opportunity to design. Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, it was a tension in the book of, do I try to be prescriptive and tell people how to like do like a good sabbatical, or do I let people kind of like stumble into it? And I do think there's lessons and there's fruit to have a mistake in a way that reveals something about yourself. But I do think there's kind of 3 things that I would advise people to do, which is at first on your sabbatical, like make space to heal. Like, get out of your head, get into your body, like heal, congratulate yourself for the leg of the journey you've just been on, instead of just going immediately into this like productivity thing where you swap out like work productivity for like an actual really important list of things that you want to do that are like intrinsically motivated, but it's just like another level of productivity. So like take a beat, rest, recover, and then use that next phase to experiment. So I was talking with a student of mine here about like the best part about business school, which I think is one of the world's most socially acceptable sabbaticals, is that you're, which is like,
I love that you're saying that because I think of my grad school experience as a sabbatical as well.
It sounds funny unless you think that, like I do, like a sabbatical is actually one of the most important things you can do with your life. Like there's no job that requires a business degree or a policy degree that requires it. But you like get a chance to do an internship, to open the aperture around what's possible, what is it like to live and travel in different countries, what other jobs are there out there, try those things on, intrinsically choose what you want to study, and then you get done and you get a promotion. Or you get a similar job and maybe it's all even at the end of your career, right? So I think that time for experimentation in the middle. Another attendee here, Paul, would use his sabbaticals for experimentation. Like he really wanted to see what would it be like, when I retire, I want to run an eco lodge. And he was like, actually, I think I'm going to test that hypothesis. And so
And
he
then
like,
we'd see Facebook posts.
yeah, exactly. And so, I worked at the front of the house of an eco lodge, worked at the back of the house, like cut vegetables, like talked to the owners, and was like, this is not a dream I actually want to. And so I think that experimentation phase is super important. And then I think the third phase is just like reintegration. So don't go from like, I'm working at an eco lodge in Costa Rica to like the job the next day.
Yeah.
Being able to kind of synthesize, and maybe you need a coach or a therapist, or maybe you look at your journals and try to figure out, like, what does this mean for the next step in the journey? Because it is such a like a scary, uncertain thing to do, we want ideally to be like, and I'm totally clear with the next step, and it's my dream job. But oftentimes we have to kind of like find our way there and take a job and kind of like, okay, I'm closer to what I want to do and who I want to be, but I'm not quite there yet.
Yeah. We really underestimate as a society how long things take. I think there is this tendency. I say because I find that I imbue it, and I kind of look back at the goals I've set for myself over time and the timelines for those things, and it's like, what crackhead set this? It's just, it's so intense and so frenetic. One of my favorite anecdotes in your book, I'm just going to highlight it in my own words, was reading about the lawyer who wanted to write the next great American novel. Because he shocked his family.
Yeah.
He quit his high-powered job.
Yeah.
He began writing the novel, and he's like, I hate writing. And I think it's so great to have the space to test the thing that you always think you want, to also put it to rest.
Totally. Yeah. It's called kind of counterfactual thinking. So you can never obviously live, well, maybe multiverse wise you can, but you can't like test what life you want to live, like all the different versions of it. And so can you use a sabbatical to try out what would it be like to be a writer? What would it be like to, be a yogi? So that you can actually have that evidence to say, well, and so that story, it's funny because on my sabbatical, I took my mom on a train trip across Canada for her 70th birthday. And, it takes a long time. It's not something I ever had time for. And it was her like best friend from college who was telling me this story about her husband, her late husband, right? And so, she kind of described it as he was always bitching about wanting to write the great American novel. But then he finally like gave himself the chance to do it, and he hated it. And he tore up the manuscript, and he was like, no one can ever read this. But he wasn't bummed about it. He was like, I'm so glad that I know that about myself. Like, I like the camaraderie, I like the community that I have around practicing law. I'm good at it. And it inspired his daughter, who then 20 years later took a sabbatical. She's, a nonprofit worker. Her husband was a teacher. They saved up for 10 years to do it. And then they did a Land Rover trip, like all the way down to the tip of Latin America. And on that trip, the Land Rover broke down a lot, as anyone who's done a trip like that can attest. And he was like, actually, I want to do this for a living. And so because they had kind of had this experience and saved up and built up this time, they as a family were like, you know what? Like, give it a year. Restore Land Rovers, take people on tours. And I just looked, he's got like 20,000 followers on Instagram. He has a Land Rover restoration business, Sonoran Rovers, in Tucson. And so not only did this John character, did he kind of like make his own life more fulfilling and with less regret, he inspired his kid, which then allowed them to live a life that they always wanted to. So this whole like power of like exemplars, like telling the story of folks who've taken a sabbatical, like that's how we change.
I have to say, in reading your book, I feel like that's the way I find myself wanting to talk with my siblings, because they've had much more of traditional careers on a track, working to get to retirement.
Yeah.
And they also have kids, and my sense is they don't want their kids to have the same experience they did. So there's like a generational shift.
Yeah.
That this could be.
And I mean, we're seeing this, when I talk to different folks. I was surprised when I talked to Connie, like whenever I talk to someone who's of an older generation, what are you working on? Well, I study sabbaticals. Like, you're always kind of like worried what they're going to say. And she was like, amazing, like John took one. And so, right. But we talk to the younger generations, and, Gen Z has this phrase where like, I don't dream of labor. So if you're like, what's your dream job? They're like, well, I don't dream of labor. And so like they will exchange salary for flexibility and mission and purpose. And like they're thinking about things differently, I think, in the way that we all want to. And that builds resentment.
Well, Finish your thought.
No, I mean, but it builds resentment among those of us who like had this story about like you work and you graduate and you work until retirement that I think we're told by our parents. So yeah,
I see who I want to bring this conversation to, and I see who I don't want to bring this conversation to, because I also think that a big piece of career and work is learning to stick with hard things.
yeah,
And I fear that, like, I literally fear, like I have kids in their 20s who I mentor.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, do I want to share this conversation with them? Because I don't want people to misinterpret it as, oh, and because I don't like this job, now it's time to leave. But why don't I like it? Oh, I don't like it because I don't know how to sit with difficult conversations,
yeah.
which is a really important life skill.
Mm-hmm.
So talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I think Tim Ferriss talked about like if like you can totally quit a project. Like if you're writing a book, you can quit writing a book if you've finished a book, right? But if you've never kind of like finished something, it's like harder to justify. Like, how many times do you quit before you finish something? But yeah, I do think like when I was first doing the research, a lot of my, as you can imagine, like folks that I knew were in my age bracket. And so it made sense that from my perspective, you work for a decade super hard and you might be burnt out. But I kept talking to people like earlier and earlier, younger and younger. I mean, I see it at business school where you're like, are you really burnt out? Like you're 24, you really burnt out? But then you look back at like when the treadmill starts for those folks, and like it's their first year on the job is not their first year on the job. They've been like on the job since middle school, trying to get into like a good high school or trying to get the right internship. And so like that's why I think that there's these inflection points in life that we need to give people permission to like step back. And I'm talking like take a summer off, take
A gap year.
Yeah, or just like gap summer, right? Like give yourself some sort of permission to step away during chunks in your life where, yes, if you're like never working fully and you're always saying you want to like quit and take time off, like that's a little bit different. But
No, I just feel like that's sort of the precautionary echo
Yeah.
in the background of this conversation, because
Totally.
I do feel like, you're not advocating. It's a fine line because it's a kind of escapism, but it's like for a point.
yeah.
Anyway, you put it in your own words.
Yeah, there's this Jungian therapist, James Hollis. He wrote this book called The Middle Passage, which I highly recommend. But he talks about how like just part of going from kind of like adolescent, like early 20s life to midlife is kind of growing out of this like fantastical realism. I can't remember the exact term, but kind of like fantasy of like I could do anything with my life into like, okay, there's actually constraints and here's what I should do. Here's how I can make a life. And I remember reading that and it hit me so hard I had to like put the book down. Where being on sabbatical actually made me feel like the aperture opened up again to be like, I can't be like I'm not going to be an astronaut. Never say never, but there are way more possibilities for what I can do with this next chunk than I think you kind of get in a bit of like an inertia, like rut is the wrong word, but kind of track, right? So I do think it opens up possibilities in a way that that is not always bad.
Let's rewind now. When you were talking about your light touch advice for structuring sabbatical, you said first and foremost healing. How did you do that? What did healing look like for you?
Well, it's definitely a lot of my sabbatical advice is do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah.
Right? No, I mean, I ended up backing into it. Like, first of all, I'd threatened and like wanted to take a sabbatical for a long time. I told my co-founders about it. We had like made a plan, but then there was always some excuse not to go. So I'd even tried to do commitment devices where I was like, I've subletted out my apartment. Like I'd have no home. Like I need to go now. And then it's like, well, like here's this business deal. And like there's this. So actually a couple of people in attendance, they got married and they were like, we're going on a tour of New Zealand to kind of introduce the family to the family. And they invited a bunch of people along. And so I was like, I officiated their wedding. Like, I guess this is the sign that I should go. And so that kicked off the sabbatical, which actually was quite healing because I was outdoors. I didn't have to plan anything. I was around friends and family. And then I went and did the pilgrimage, which I would not describe as like restful or healing. But I was actually like invited into that by, I think, a pretty healing, incentive.
One layer more. What were you healing from?
we are on the couch here. No, I think part of it was this concept that, I talk about in the book how I was afraid of having a midlife crisis, like as a kid. Like I don't know where I got that from, but
That's a very funny line.
yeah. And so I thought that how I would avoid that is by like working in my dream job. It's like you can't burn out, you can't have a midlife crisis if you're like totally satisfied with what you're doing. And so I was fortunate to find that. Like I found these professors that created this technology that could enable access to finance in emerging markets. So the mission was there. I loved the people in my company. We were growing. It was going well. But then ultimately, it was not as fulfilling to me anymore. And so that was like a bit of an existential crisis, because if you feel like you found the thing you want to do and it's no longer fulfilling, like what's going to fulfill you now, right? And so it was a bit of kind of mourning, and I think like being uncertain about what's wrong with me that this doesn't feel like what I want to do anymore. It was, so it's like this burnout was one part of the equation, I think, which like a lot of people can identify with. But then there was also this kind of pull where I was like being pulled to investigate some parts of my life and my identity that I really wanted. Like I wanted to have like a spiritual search. I wanted to spend more time with my family. They felt like they were important things, but never urgent. Like you were talking about how the urgent things always get priority. And so is that like cracking open of your identity. Like what happens when I get rid of this? Like, am I mourning the loss of it? Will I come back? It's all very uncertain. So I think, all of those like very simple, very small things I was thinking about.
In Big Time Off, you profile a man who's very type A management consultant, who ends up burning out, which is I feel like that's a whole other term that if you dissect, well, what did it mean? It becomes a roadmap for then what might your sabbatical look like.
Totally.
But can you talk about him in the story?
Yeah. It's funny. There's so many interesting stories about this person and like that archetype in general, which is you have a person who has like hit all the marks in their life, right? Like went to a good school, got a great job, like moving up in the job. And I think management consulting is actually a pretty great field in the sense that when you're not working, you're off, right? You work in these kind of like projects, you're full on when you're working. When you're off between projects, you're off. I mean, so it's actually designed to be able to give people like time in between. And a lot of people use that for sabbatical-like things. And so on one of his kind of times in between, he took a few months off and was like, I want to learn how to backcountry ski. So he like went to British Columbia, just like full on backcountry ski, like how many vertical feet can I ski per day? How many miles did I do? And he was like tracking it on a spreadsheet, tracking. And then he realized, he's like, oh wow, like you took the consultant out of consulting, but like actually I brought myself along, right? Mm-hmm. And then for the next sabbatical, he was burnt out, and also his father had just been diagnosed with a terminal disease, and so it was this time where he was like, oh my gosh, like this is it, and I want to be there for my dad. I also need to heal, and so for the healing portion, which again, like your mileage may vary on whether this feels like healing, but joined a sail crew to go from the Galapagos to French Polynesia. And then came back and was like present there to be with his father, like during the last few months of his journey. And all of this happened because consulting enabled him to kind of step back away, and he was present for like an extremely difficult time in his life, in his father's life, but he was present for it. Mm-hmm. So this is where we think about sabbaticals as like sipping coconuts on the beach or something. But oftentimes it's to do something that's really important that might be really difficult, but it's very human, and we're actually giving it time to breathe and time to be present.
That term, you'd said that feeling human is what your research subjects just said over and over and over again. I feel human.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little. Yeah.
It's one of those, talking about sabbaticals in general is difficult because there's a lot of like woo-woo stuff that people say. And so how do you describe it in a way that like when we have our productivity, like business hats on, like convince us of the business case, but also like bring out the qualitative aspect that people are describing. And again, the way that people describe the impact of their sabbatical in research lingo is kind of like a peak life experience. So having the same impact on their life as a wedding day, a birth of a child, a funeral, right? And and so some of the terminology that people would use is I felt more human again. I felt more human again. And I don't think anyone going on sabbatical is like, I want to go on sabbatical to feel more human. It's a thing that you kind of realize that you were lacking, and you were living kind of like a machine, like input sleep, input food, input working out, output work, and then like redo that again.
And what do you think that is exactly? Again, go a level deeper. Like,
Yeah.
what is that? What do you think that means? And don't worry about going woo. I actually like that.
Yeah. What does it mean that that's how we operate?
Feeling human. What are people
Yeah.
talking about? Is it the sense of interconnection with others? Is it the sense, like, just what does that mean?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was on KQED today, and the host Mina was talking about how they took 2 months away with their family. She has 3 kids, and one day towards the end of her time, and we were talking because I say like it's got to be at least 2 months because it takes 6 weeks to truly like feel like yourself again. And people are like, man, it's a long time. And she was like, exactly, like 6 weeks. I remember I was sitting in a cafe in Bilbao, and I turned to my husband and I said, it's just a job. And he was like, what do you mean? She's like, it's just a job. Like I could leave, it's just a job. And he's like, yeah. And so like how do you write about that? I mean, like a more talented writer, I'm sure, could do it, but like where someone has a realization like that, there's someone in the audience as well who I remember they did a cross-country road trip to start off their sabbatical where they ended up traveling around the world. And they had this realization where they slept in a Walmart parking lot because, like, hot tip, if you're on like road trip, you can sleep in Walmart parking lot, like they won't kick you out. And they woke up and they're eating like leftover chili. I'm going to get the details on like leftover chili in a bowl from last night for breakfast. And they just kind of looked at each other and they're just like, this is our life now. Right? Which like doesn't sound like an amazing life, maybe, like, but they're like, this is life and this could be life and it won't be life forever. But those kinds of things that remind us, like, they weren't looking at their calendar, they weren't looking at their inbox. They were looking forward as to like what the possibilities are, and not like I do this job and like here's my,
Yeah.
It's hard to describe.
Yeah. No, one of my favorite healers, a woman named Irina Lenetskaya, who I've mentioned to you, she has this way of putting it, which is that what she observes, because she does a lot of healing for very type A people, what she observes is that you spend your life running one step faster than the terror chasing you. That's how she puts it. And I know my first intentional experience of not doing that is when I stopped to write my first book. And I actually had this sense of like my true self, not the one governed by alphanumerics and like, got it done, but like this sort of settling happening.
Yeah.
And so when I was reading this feeling human again, I was like, if we had more of a vocabulary for what that is, but I love the term. I love the term. I'm going to remind people, by the way, that we are collecting questions from the audience, and feel free to get personal. He said he didn't want to give advice. Let's make him give advice. Do your thing, put it out there. I mean, you came here tonight. We value and honor your time, and we want to feel like, we're upending your entire life by the end of this conversation. That's the goal, right? So as we're waiting for audience questions to gather, I guess I'll ask another question that actually has to do with privilege in this. I know that for me, taking big time off required a financial windfall. Like, I paused my work as an NPR correspondent to write a book really only because I was getting paid multiples of my annual salary to write that book. And I present that because, for me, it wasn't as simple as, oh, I want to like run cross country and sleep in Walmart parking lots. I've been financially providing for my parents since I was 17. I have 2 siblings who have done the same. And you imagine family dynamics. Imagine 2 siblings who are hard at work in lives that are so routine, and then the youngest child's like, bye. Like, there are so many things that you're navigating when you talk about, your own freedom or your own time, paying bills for children, paying more. So, and I get your point about a lot of people have more leeway than we imagine we do, and so many of the barriers are psychological. Just the fear of change is real. But then there's also actually, no, like if I don't pay my mom's bills, she will be homeless.
Yeah, I talk about like the barriers of taking a sabbatical in the book as psychological and then logistical. And so the psychological stuff I think is interesting because it prevents people that have the means to do it. I mean, Americans in general are bad at taking vacation. I think we leave around a third of our paid vacation days unused every year. The highest earning Americans are even worse, which is interesting, right? And so if we don't give ourselves permission for those of us that have the privilege to take time off, then you have this weird dynamic called the work devotion norm, where the people underneath you, even if there's a policy, won't take the leave, right? And so, first of all, I think that those of us who do have the privilege to take it need to take it, and they need to talk about it, and they need to develop policies that enable sabbaticals. Because at the end of the day, like there are countries, there are companies. Sweden, you can take 6 months off to work on a business idea. Australia, all civil servants get long service leave, which came from the fact that it took a long time to sail from the UK to Australia to be a civil servant. And they were like, we're not getting rid of this. It's awesome, right? And so I think it's about like, how do you create policies that enable people to do so, where you don't have to make this trade-off of how am I going to pay the rent? It just becomes part of how we work, in society. But as with any change, I think it starts with how can you enable the systems, whether it's like public policy or company policies, so that it's equitable and fair, as opposed to have it be something that only the privileged can do. So that's the journey that we're on.
Great. So let me start taking audience questions. You talk about the effects of a sabbatical or the skills sabbatical takers develop throughout their time off. And then when people return, what is your recommendation for people experiencing, how do they integrate those skills back into their everyday post-sabbatical life?
I mean, for some people, you might not, right? Like I wrote my first song when I was on sabbatical, and like I have not integrated that. I don't think. Well, I guess like I'll sing to my kid now, but and so I think part of it is like some of this aspect of being human like doesn't come into play as much inside of our work hours, but we might have this realization that those are things that we would like to set greater boundaries around. So it's actually part of your family time. But otherwise, I think, and this is where if you've taken a sabbatical, I think you can actually have these like micro sabbatical moments in life, which is just trying to remind yourself of like, how did I feel? Like, how many sunsets did I watch on sabbatical? How many sunsets do I watch in like every day? Like, I'm gonna watch one sunset a week. I'm gonna like set it on my calendar, like go outside the office and watch a sunset. To try to like bring that humanity back in, doing things that make you uncomfortable, doing experiments with like what you do for work and life. But I think the one concrete recommendation I give in the book is like you have to journal. I know like some people hate journaling. But you have to see like, who were you at the beginning? What did you learn? What observations did you have about yourself and about life in the middle? And then how do you integrate those learnings at the end? And I think if you can call back to that, which I do in my journal, it just becomes incredibly like easier to say like, like I said that I was going to do this and I'm not doing it. Like, why?
Yeah. I do have to shout out for journaling. I find it such a useful activity, not just for writers, but I will say that the primary use of my journal these days, the journal I've kept for years, is for me to wince at earlier versions of myself and inspire as I write my next book.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my God, who was she? It's awesome.
Yeah.
And then if you can kind of get over the, the sheer embarrassment, it seems like a great thing to pass on to, the next generation.
Yeah.
Here's another question. I love speaking of words. You say you don't like the word sabbatical. Do you have another word? Do you have a replacement word?
A lot of folks have tread into this water where my friend Shelley wrote a book called Soulbatical. Like when I was thinking about what to call this, I did the kind of Occam's razor, like people know this word, it works. It does have this like borrowing of prestige from academia around it. So I hope that we can just say, like, I'm going sailing with my family for 2 months. And you don't have to say, like, I'm going on sabbatical. Like, this is my important identity. But I'm accepting suggestions. So please let me know.
I like sabbatical. Okay. In your discussion of sabbaticals, you put a lot of things in the same category: gap years, externships, entrepreneur in residence programs. Why did you decide to include these in this term? Do they provide the same opportunities for growth, skill development, life transformation?
Yeah, I mean, one of the goals of the book is to kind of like shine the light on existing sabbaticals that are already out there, so that people don't think like, I've never heard of someone taking a year off, and so how could I actually put that into action? So taking Entrepreneur in Residence, for example, which I think was created in the Bay Area, where like a VC firm is essentially saying like, you're an entrepreneur in residence. You've left your company, you've sold your company, and you get a title and like a hot desk and like an email address. But you have this position where you feel like you can say like, I'm doing something, I think, which gives people time and kind of permission to ease into the next thing. So Entrepreneur in Residence, we talked about the MBA, a Fulbright fellowship. There's all these things that we can do if we feel as though like being off will look bad on a resume, or we need to kind of like call it in a different way. Mm-hmm. I call them sabbaticals hidden in plain sight. So like take whatever excuse you can to be away from routine work, and make the most of it.
It's so interesting to me. You're making me think about a huge cultural rift I experienced between the East and West Coast of the U.S. Because growing up in New York City and always living on the East Coast, there was this notion of you work, next job, next job, next job. And I don't know if it's an East Coast thing or just the virtue of me leaving my family where there's the immigrant work ethic of nonstop. But I remember moving to San Francisco where gaps in resumes were actually seen as something cool.
Yeah.
And not just by like peers, but like by old people.
Yeah.
Of which I am now a part.
Yeah.
And I wonder, do you think that do you observe cultural differences around the country or pockets of the country with this conversation?
Totally. Yeah. And this is where I think having this like example in one's life can give you permission. It changes that story of what's possible. Again, I was talking with the host today about her dad was an academic. And so they had like these like academic sabbaticals, which for professors, like you have 3 jobs. It's like departmental responsibilities, teaching, and research. And so you get to like put away 2 of those jobs and just do research. So it's not like really like you're doing a lot of work. It's just like different, like less work. But for the families, and my wife is one of them, where like her dad was an academic, they got to like live in France, like live in Australia, like have these different experiences where even if you're still kind of doing similar work, you're providing this very different experience for your family. And so like if you have a story in your life where that was possible, then your life, you're like, well, I took a sabbatical as a kid. Like I want to do that. And I think similarly, on the West Coast, maybe it's like with this entrepreneur in residence thing, there's like gaps in between jobs. 2022, LinkedIn introduced the career breaks feature, which like, if you think about it, like this repository of all of our resumes said like, okay, now you can call a career break a job. Like it has like a line on the thing and you can describe it. And millions of people have put that on there. Mm-hmm. And so like overnight it becomes something that like, it's on my LinkedIn profile. Like I'm not hiding it on my resume. I'm like literally describing the gap. And I would hazard to guess, I don't have the data, that the majority of people using that are on the West Coast. Or, like in these kind of jobs where it's like, it's a badge of honor. Yeah. It turns you into something interesting. It allows you to say something about yourself that you think is important and interesting. We can all see what the job skills are, but it adds like a little bit of personality to it. Yeah.
No, it seemed to be really proliferated or concentrated in startup culture, right? Like I wouldn't say that people I met on the West Coast in finance were like that, unless it was like Bitcoin, right? So no, that's interesting. But it's also, as you're saying with the LinkedIn taking a break, it with every cultural shift, it's like it requires this movement to break shame, right? And I'm saying this like we've seen so many movements at this point where this is like, I obviously thinking a very different movement, Me Too. It's like the breaking of shame to have a transformation, and then how you designed for that at scale is wild.
Yeah.
Here is another question: what changes would you make for sabbaticals to be financially accessible to everyday workers rather than just the privileged?
Yeah. We had a caller kind of call in today who had a union job, and he was just like, listen, sounds nice, but it's not possible. And, I've found a lot of pockets of the world, a lot of unions that actually support these things, like teachers unions, things like that. And so I think it's really starting from like grassroots of saying like, what is it that we value in our employment contracts? And can we kind of mobilize to make that possible? Like one of my favorite stories are there's these nonprofits. I think one of the recipients of this fellowship, the Miller Fellowship, is here today, but I'm not sure. This is in Detroit, where they give stipends to nonprofit leaders to take a sabbatical, and so they give you a financial stipend as the person taking it. They give the organization financial coverage so that they can like give people bonuses inside the organization, hire people in if they need to. And they convince the boards of those organizations to give their leaders sabbaticals. And, I quote Warren Buffett in the book. It's like, time is the friend of a great company and the enemy of a mediocre. Like these boards are having to say like, okay, the founders, the leaders of these nonprofits, like we need to make sure that the organization can survive them if they leave or if something happens to them. And we want to like give those people a chance to rest and recover and try to bring like new ideas and energy to the organization. And so I think if people can mobilize to enable nonprofit leaders and nonprofit employees to take sabbaticals, if some unions can start integrating these into their policies and bargaining, then that's kind of like starting the movement. But it has to happen from all sides. Again, it has to happen starting from people that have the privilege to do it, the financial means, talking about it, implementing policies inside their organizations. So I think it's like a movement kind of growing in two directions.
From an employer's perspective, what about the fear of, wait, why would I design a policy that accelerates me losing a valuable worker, right? Retention of talent is super hard. Like I know at NPR with their sabbatical policy, you can't just say, oh, I want to take it. You have to make the case for it. You have to make the case that it's directly relevant to your value to the company.
Yeah.
There's an entire line of argument that has to go into proving it. And I would imagine that across the board, it's really expensive to acquire, train, retain employees.
Yeah.
And so just why would an employer want to do this?
Yeah. Well, I think, back to the quote, I think a great company is thinking on more of a longer term basis. Like, is it inconvenient for someone to leave your company? Absolutely. Are people going to leave your company no matter what? Like, are people going to turn over? Are they going to go on parental leave? Like, yes. And so as a company, you have to build resilience to stand someone leaving, understanding what their job responsibilities are, having other people do it, bringing someone in, training them. Like, that's the muscle of all good companies. One of the folks who I was talking to who took a sabbatical earlier this week, he takes a month every year and like 2 months every 2 years. And I think he's operating from a position of power, but he's basically describing to his employer, like, here's how much it's going to cost you if I leave and you have to train someone. What I do is I take 2 months off every 2 years, and that's the deal. And I'll kind of like help the organization withstand that. I'll, transmit my responsibilities to other people. I'll absorb them. But, I think it's about an organization building that resilience, that muscle to replace people. And also, like, our data did not show that most people leave after taking a sabbatical. It showed that people come back. They have more loyalty to the company that now has demonstrated that they care about them as a human outside of just like their tasks. They come back with creativity to attack problems in different ways. I think right now in the age of AI, I'm getting this a lot where people, like, you're working really hard, and then everyone's like, well, you have to also learn AI. And they're like, okay, I guess I'll like work even harder to like learn AI on top of my, and like the people who are taking time off are saying like, actually, I'm like running a fun experiment with AI. I'm like creating a tool to help me like figure out what I want to do next with my job, or I'm like creating a tool to help me like organize my bookshelf, and they're coming back with actually like a portfolio and knowledge and experience of working with it from a position of curiosity and love. as opposed to like fear and like I have to do this in order to keep my job. And so, a lot of people are coming back with,
That still kind of sounds to me like, okay, that's just like a company improved project.
yeah,
Or-
well, I don't think it has to be something that applies to the company. It's more about like being creative in a way that you come back and you say, I'm restored, I'm rejuvenated, like I'm ready to do this next leg of the journey.
One of the questions shared here, you began to answer it, is what are, from your research, just kind of the myths that you busted, or like, no, that's just is not how this works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that one of the most surprising things, I mean, first of all, like 2/3 of sabbaticals are catalyzed by a negative event. So like we wait until like a job crisis, a relationship crisis, a health crisis strikes us to take time off, as opposed to like proactive. Like we all say like, I'm going to do it one of these days. And then we wait until like some emergency happens that forces us to. So that I think was surprising. The other thing is that people expect you to be on sabbatical and just having an amazing time the whole time. So like anyone who's been on sabbatical here, like they're difficult. You're often processing like tough stuff that like force you over the edge into sabbatical land. You're dealing with like, who am I? What's this like identity when I don't have my job and my work? And like all of those things that kind of rush in when you have the vacuum of your work identity leaving. So I remember like I had two of my best friends from high school came and like surprised me and like visited me in Japan right as I was gonna start off my pilgrimage. And like they were expecting to be like so like oh my gosh, like you're on sabbatical, it's amazing. And I was like processing some tough stuff, and I was like not a fun hang. And I was like, I'm sorry, and so I think it's like a human experience you're going. It's like transformation, which is not always clean and fun. You're not like sipping coconuts on the beach.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I have the theory that a lot of people who are like hardworking and have very strong reactions against this concept are afraid to sit with themselves. And so it's like that John Kabat-Zinn idea of wherever you go, there you are. And so it's like, what would happen if you had to slow down?
Yeah.
Because also work, it gives you a kind of escape route away from a lot
Yeah.
of what's inside,
Totally.
Okay, so the audience, I want to thank the person in this audience who
no.
really just laid themselves out on this card. As a burned out venture investor, where 6 to 12 months out of the game results in perceived loss of relevance, loss of being current, and a family person with 2 kids who need a constant parent, how should I plan a sabbatical to reset my healthy relationships and career goals? My health, my relationships, my career goals.
Yeah. The first thing is everyone's worried about like if I take 6 months off, like will I disappear in people's minds? And I think what actually happens is you take 6 months off and you come back and you're like, hey, I just took 6 months off. And everyone's like, what? I thought you just left yesterday. Like people are busy. They're like thinking about themselves. And so I think that's way more likely to happen than folks being like, well, you've been out of the game for so long. But I think the second thing is like a lot of us are burnt out and we're like, we want a sabbatical tomorrow. And then we're like, well, how can you do that? It's expensive. It's difficult, right? Like you have to set the clock forward. Like the rallying crab and use like, what are we doing in 2031? I have no idea, right? Like, okay, great. 2031, the summer of 2031, like we're taking 2 months off. And like put the stakes far enough in the future that you're like, okay, I'm going to tell my job, I'm going to get my firm up to the place where they can survive without me for a few months. I'm going to like, get my kids out of school or like not in summer programs in that summer. I'm going to
Not
save
an
up money.
emergency exit when your life is on fire.
Totally. It's like I want this to feel over the course of our life like, teeth cleanings instead of like root canals that just like come up in an emergency. And so I would say like, as much as I know you want to take it now, like, can you do it 3 years from now, 2 years from now, and like plan it financially, logistically, so it's not so painful. And like, then you have a light at the end of the tunnel that you're working towards, as opposed to being like, I work from when I graduate all the way until I retire, like no breaks. That's like a tough thing to pull off.
What's your sense from your research about, do a lot of people who go on sabbatical realize they really don't like their job, even if they're very good at it anymore? Like, where do people fall on that?
I think it's, that's definitely an archetype. I think there's this archetype where people go from like full-time working for a company to then they come back and they say, like, actually I want to work for myself, but do the same kind of work. So kind of like put a little like slack in the system so you can spend more time with family, that kind of thing. I think there's a group that they go and they say like, actually I hated what I was doing, right? And like, I'm glad that I can now realize that. and really getting yourself out of this soup that we swim in, which is like, I call it functional workaholism, where we hear a lot about like burnout, which I think is like an end state, like you're burnt out. But this functional workaholism is more dangerous, where you don't realize that you're not performing at your best, or you're performing like not great, until you get away from it long enough to have that like fully make sense. So a lot of people in the study, it's like trigger finger, eczema, like all sorts of like health, like ulcers, where their doctor's like, this is stress related. And they say like, okay, well, how about I cut off coffee? They're like, it's work related. And then until you actually get out of that, you're like, oh, those cleaned up, like I'm fine again. Like I feel human again. And those people are probably like quitting and doing something else, as they should. But then there's also a big chunk of folks that, I think of this woman from the book who worked at the US Treasury. They have this like leave without pay, not paid. But you can take it every 7 years, I think. And so she was like, worked in kind of like international development, and, went down to Patagonia, did all this backpacking and trekking, was able to be present for like an illness in the family. And while she was in Latin America, she was like, I love the work that I do. Like it helps people. And it brings me meaning. And like, I love backpacking, but I'm not gonna backpack forever. And so she came back and was like, I'm going back. I love my work, and I'm gonna do this again in 5 years. And that's like a good enough balance to say like a little bit for me, a little bit for the job, but like no major shakeup. I think we want to get to the place where there's no like major shakeups every time. It's just more of like a thing you do 6 months out of the span of a 40-year career. It's like 1%. Right.
Okay, last question, and it's actually going to be me paraphrasing something back to you that I think is a message I've gotten from our conversation and from your book, and then you can just kind of respond and correct and but synthesize. There's been throughout the conversation at certain moments this question about privilege and having the privilege, and it takes privilege to do this. And I wonder, is that notion the underlying problem? Is it if we think of it as a privilege as opposed to as something that should be routine, much like, we didn't used to have 2 days off a week for working class people, but now it's understood that Saturday and Sunday for many people is off. Is that like the shift that you want? Like, do you want to fight that notion?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I think anything that is related to not increasing the amount of productivity is a fight that we have to have as individuals, right? And so I think it's a notion where I'm trying to identify a world where in a 50-year career, we can say 6 months of those we borrow from retirement and kind of sprinkle earlier. And it absolutely is a privilege now, right? Like leisure is a privilege. And every time there's been like a technological improvement, all the economists say like, well, we're going to be so much more productive. Like, what are we going to do with all of our leisure time? Like the work week's going to be 15 hours. And what ends up happening is we take that additional slack in the system and we reinvest it into having more productivity during that time. And so I think now is actually a really important inflection point in our society around like, okay, if you have these agents that are doing all of your work for you, do you work less? Or do the agents work a ton more and you're like responding to the agents and you're actually like online all the time? So I think it's an important inflection point for us to say like, how can we make time for ourselves not feel like a privilege, not feel like the exception, and instead be part of a healthy, flourishing life?
I realized I had one more question that we just don't have time for you to answer, but I'll say it because people are going to line up to buy your book and talk to you. And so ask DJ about whether parental leave, maternity leave, paternity leave is a sabbatical or not.
Yeah.
Because we should have had that conversation, and my bad. I highlighted it in bold because, you know what, 2 minutes.
Yeah. No, I mean, the answer is no. And also having just had a kid, like like how I've seen the world has changed so significantly from this event that I can see why people are talking about it in the same paragraph as like you have an experience, it changes the way you view the world forevermore going forward. But like, you're adding on all these other responsibilities and jobs. You're not like having an absence of jobs, but it is a job that like brings a lot of meaning to your life and brings a lot of joy.
Makes you feel human.
Makes you feel human.
Yeah, but I agree with that sort of, bristling at lumping it in the same place, but it's what so many women I know associate with a sabbatical. Oh,
no.
I birthed a human and continued the human race. That was my sabbatical.
Yeah. You will not find that in the book anywhere. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, DJ Dodonna, author of Big Time Off, The Transformative Power of Sabbaticals and How to Take One. We encourage you to pick up a copy of DJ's book here or at your local bookstore. And for information about Commonwealth Club World Affairs membership and upcoming programs, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Arthi Shahani. Thank you so much.